You want to get better at building, huh? Well, fortunately for you, I have the perfect video for you today. In today's video, I have compiled 5 subjects, along with so many tips, which I think you guys could really use. With that being said, let's get on to the video. Timestamps in the description down below. To start things off, I think the most important thing you have to do is clarify the style of house you want to make. For example, modern mansions, just modern houses, these kind of houses, medieval Europe, anything. Now, the second step is more so a recommendation for those who have even less experience in building than I do, and really don't know what they want to build or where to start. I can highly recommend you look around for inspirations. Just get a rough idea of what you want to do, and Google it, or look around in some YouTube videos, just something. Look for inspiration, and allow yourself to be inspired. Heck, let my builds inspire you. And what I mean by inspire is that you take parts of someone's build and implement it into your own style. If you want to build something on your own without copying anyone, then I recommend you clarify the palette. Now, I'll get to the palette in detail in a second. The second step would be the layout. The layout is you mark where you want the walls, how big you want the house to be, its shape, etc. I can recommend using carpet. If you want to have a old-ish or just medieval type European, honestly, I don't even know what my inspiration was. I just like these type of roofs. It's probably European. What I've done here, though, for the support structure, I have made sure that it's not flush against the wall. Here, let's take a closer look. Here, you see these 2 support beams. They're both on the exterior of the wall. And around here by the corner, it is directly diagonal, not touching the wall. It's constantly on the exterior of the wall. And the purpose of this is to give the build depth, which is extremely important in building. In fact, one of the most important things that detailing does is give the build depth. For example, I am not finished with this roof yet, but you can't see much depth in it because it's all the same block. And because it's all the same block, you don't see how many blocks back it goes. Well, only when I zoom in, you can barely see that there is actually depth and it's not just flat. Here I have a design for the roof. It's a rough texture I'm going to implement in the roof later. And you can see with this, with just the different types of blocks, that there is more depth to it. Back to the layout. If you are going to do a structure similar to this, and you want a bunch of support beams on the exterior, I would build that first. Have the layout, then put in the support beams. Get the height you want. The visible wall will be this. Now, once you've done this, you essentially have the layout. You know how tall the first layer of the house should be. And if you want to make multiple layers of the house, like this one, I recommend you extend the support beams. Not exactly like this, but just make it taller. Or if you want it to be small like this, going straight into the roof, then this would be enough, and the roof would sit on top. The entrance should also be defined as well. Now you have a complete rough layout. You know how tall the house or this floor is going to be. You know the shape of it. This is great. You know where the walls want to go. I find this to be very, very useful when it comes to building. Anyways, back to the palettes. Now, palettes. How can I decide what I want for my palette? I don't know. You should just come up with something, I guess. My recommendation is that you come up with 2 blocks that kind of work with each other, but that are not that similar. For example, black and blue, that combination of blocks, or colors at least, it works well, but they are very different from each other. In this example, I have the palette that I have used for my latest build, the one that I was standing on in the intro. My 2 palette blocks, the main part of the palette. So there's going to be different sections of the palette, and then there's going to be subparts of the palette, which you will use for detailing. For example, if I have a wood type as my main theme for my palette, then as a sub palette, I'll have stairs, fences, trapdoors of that same wood type, and I would utilize that to give it detail, and that belongs to the sub palette. For this example, the first choice was sandstone. That is the main block. I'm gonna place it down over here. When you're making palettes, to visualize, it's great to just place it down so you know what you're working with. So now I have sandstone. I want to make a sandstone based build. That means I'm probably gonna make the walls out of sandstone because the walls have a lot of surface area. I'll make the roof a different color because the whole point of the palette is that there are multiple different types of blocks. And part of this section of the palette, I'm now going to search for all the blocks that work really well with sandstone. I find that to be stripped birch, obviously the sandstone stairs, walls, that belongs to the sub palette, birch fences, sub palette, the slabs versus sub palette, and then we have the cut sandstone and sand. I find this combination of blocks to work fantastically. I'm also going to place the sub palette. Placing the sub palette is not necessary. You just want to see how well this palette works. Let's figure out what the other half of the main palette should be. The other half of the palette, I decided to challenge myself, as I am continuously doing, because I find it fun. I recommend you just look for any palette. It doesn't have to be interesting. I just wanted to challenge myself. So, as my palette choice, mangrove. The blocks that worked well with it were all these. These are part of the actual palette that I have, and these are sub palette. I'll place down the sub palette, although once again, this isn't necessary. And great, now you have your palette along with a sub palette. The palette is just the basis of the types of blocks you want to implement in your build. It is completely okay that you add some blocks that aren't in your palette. In fact, it's almost a good thing to add a little bit of variation from your palette. This doesn't mean that you're going to make a palette and consciously leave out a few blocks that you know you're going to add. I still highly recommend you add those to your palette. But just know that I find it completely okay that you use blocks, and it is completely okay that you use blocks that isn't part of the palette. The goal of the palette is only to lay out the basis of the color scheme and the types of blocks you want to use in your build. If you eventually need other blocks that aren't part of the palette, use them. If they work well, use them. Now, this isn't the entirety of my palette, so here's my main palette. I have mangrove and sandstone. I have these blocks, which I intended to only have scattered. I didn't want to go 50-50, I just wanted the occasional crimson to give it a little bit of variation. Over here, I have the main structure. So this is palette for the external structure. In all these blocks, I didn't lay in my palette. For the house that you saw in the SMP, you may have had noticed that I didn't really use all too much mangrove, and that's because I didn't know how to implement it. Usually the second color would be, well, using the second color of the palette for the roof is usually genuinely a good idea. If you're going for other types of builds, then I'm sure using the palette elsewhere is also a great idea. But in my build, I couldn't really find places to implement it, and it still looked good. That's because I chose a challenging palette. If you want to stick more to your palette, there would absolutely be other ways to implement it. I just really wanted to make a spruce roof. I wanted to use barrels. That is literally my only excuse. I wanted a spruce roof. As a external palette, I've decided to use a large variety of spruce. But yeah, this would be my structure from external, as you could see. I didn't use any logs. This is just the basis for the wood type. And then I used this surrounding all my windows and lining the roof, because this color is very similar to spruce logs. Now you know how to make a palette, you know what a palette is. Now you know how to figure out exactly what you want to do. But wait, you have all these different blocks, but how are you going to implement it into a wall without it looking dodgy? Well, there are a few different ways you can blend a palette of blocks together. Now, the first type is scattered. Everything is placed at random. The goal is to make it look as random as possible. And if some blocks look weird because there's like a group of them there and everything else is scattered, then you just replace it with a different block. That happens from time to time. But if you're happy with it, then you're happy with it. It's just a taste thing. This only really works if your palette is very close to each other, when the palette differentials are very, very similar. Now, this is very important, and I forgot to say it in the video, but for the scattered blend type, you just use 3 blocks. You can theoretically go beyond that, but what I've found is that it works best at 3 blocks. So just have 3 blocks in this scattered palette. Yeah. For example, this. Now, if you look at these 3 blocks, they're very similar to each other. And because of this, you can almost place them at random, and because they look so similar to each other, it doesn't look bad at all. Now, the second blend type is gradients, which is a little more complex than randomly placing blocks that look similar to each other. But I'll explain how it works and how you get to the point of making gradients in the first place. For making gradients, it's very easy to watch this tutorial or guide video thing, I still don't know what this is, and just agree with everything I'm saying and go, ah yes, I know how it works, but I highly recommend that you follow along for this part. Try to find a different palette, a palette that I haven't used, and just try to get a good gradient out of it. You're gonna need to figure out how you're gonna make the walls. So you have this palette, but how are you gonna do it? How do gradients work in walls with this palette? Because if I make it all scattered, then it'll look weird because of how different these 2 blocks are. Well, what I can recommend here is you take the palette and you order it from the most similar to the least similar. So the blocks that look the most different from each other should be on either side of this palette. Okay, great. Now you have a visible gradient inside of the palette. How are you going to implement this? The way you make gradients and the way you can make them easily is that you choose either one of these blocks and you essentially find points of where these blocks will be. And then you build gradients following the palette until it eventually reaches the other end. For example, the wall, I'm going to have this as a basis. I'm going to add a little bit of depth, so there's a little bit of variation. That's just for this design. And I'm going to add these on top of it. Then you would add sand and sandstone. But that seems a little bit boring still. How can I make it a little more interesting while still using the gradients? Because this is a gradient. This is a correct gradient, I find. I find that these 2 blocks are very similar. So what I did here is that I used this idea. I used this block as only a primary, and I used this as a secondary. Meaning, essentially, in easier terms, I place sand occasionally. Maybe like this, 1 in every 4, 1 in every 5, just occasionally dotted so it looks slightly different. On top of this then, I'll place sandstone. Yet again, within my sandstone, this looks a little bit boring because there's just so much sandstone. Within my sandstone, I'm going to place block of sand, just the occasional spot, and that makes all the difference. You can see here in this example that there are 4 stone thingies and it doesn't look all too nice. So what I would actually do here in this example is, well, first of all, you're gonna want to have to space out the random dots. If everything's on like the same block, just all stacked up on each other, it doesn't look very spread at all. So I recommend that they're in different places. Now you basically, once you have this step, you basically make gradients that looks decent. You chose this block at the bottom, it's at the base of the build. That's where this block is. Then you take the second block that looks most similar to this, but because then that would look boring and you want it to look a little more textured, use this as a the occasional block so it looks different from time to time. And so this doesn't get too repetitive because it's a relatively small side of the palette. You also spot some sand in there as well, so it doesn't get too repetitive. And making samples of walls isn't the only thing you should do. You should make samples of everything. But for example, this is the palette I'm going to use. This is how I'm going to detail my roof. And I tested it out and I figured out exactly what I wanted. And I recommend you figure out the designs you want by making small little like portions like this or that wall over there. And with that, you essentially have a successful gradient. This doesn't have to be at the bottom. This can also be a spot. For example, I don't know, you're making a roof, and then you have this spot, and then you build out from your gradients. This one will be sand. Then you're placing a bunch of sandstone. since there's sand. You could also do it like this. In this example, it doesn't really do all too much because you can't see the difference between the cut sandstone and the sandstone from above. But you can also do just like that. This is the spot, this is the speck, and then you have the gradient radiating out of it until you reach this block, or the polar opposite, and you use that block quite a lot. With that, now you've learned two different blend types, the gradients. You know what palettes are, you know what sub-palettes are, you know what to look for. And you also know, if you don't know where to start, just look for inspiration. And you can you can let it inspire you to then basically allow yourself to implement parts of a build that you really like into your own build, into your own style. Or in some cases, it isn't a horrible idea if you decide to try to copy something, even if it's 90%. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, found it useful, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. I'll really appreciate it. Have a good one.